Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, just a question or two for the proponent of the resolution.
Please proceed.
Mr. Speaker. I just want to be clear, and I recollect, I think, from the debate that we had on this last year, that the provisions of the amendment that is before us would allow for, or really just call for the removal of a restriction. Is that true through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Jutila.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And by removing the restriction, one of the possibilities is that a future legislature, by legislation, could enact a law that would allow for early voting. I think I've heard a lot of discussion on that, but I just want to be clear in my own mind that that's one of the possibilities that's out there. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Jutila.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's correct.
And since the restriction we're talking about is a requirement that the voters gather on Election Day to cast their ballots, that once that restriction about gathering, that requirement of gathering is eliminated, is there anything in this amendment or anywhere else in the Constitution that would prohibit the legislature from passing a law, for example, that would allow for late voting, that is, voting to continue after Election Day? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Jutila.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no, there is nothing that would permit late voting.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And is there anything that would prohibit, again, because of this restriction about gathering, that's what we're talking about eliminating, is there anything that would prohibit the legislature from enacting legislation to allow for Internet voting? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Jutila.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing in the resolution that would prohibit the General Assembly taking up the topic of Internet voting if in its wisdom it deemed that appropriate.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say that there's a reason why we have constitutions. The purpose of a constitution is, among other things, to set up a framework of government so that it sets up structures for people to use, to follow, to understand how they are supposed to govern themselves. And another purpose of a constitution is to protect the rights, frequently of minorities, sometimes of majorities, from the actions of the government itself, when something might be of interest to those who hold a public office that is contrary perhaps to the interests of the general public. And it's that latter part, the idea of protecting the rights of citizens and guaranteeing that individual rights and the rights of minorities are protected, we focus a lot of our attention on. And that's one of the main things when we talk about something being unconstitutional, or that we have a constitutional right that is being protected, and we claim that that right is being infringed by the government in some way. That's what we're talking about, that protection of that kind of individual right. And there's a reason, I think, why our Constitution has restrictions and limitations when it comes to voting, because how we vote and how we set up a system that guarantees accurate results and guarantees that there is a reduced or as little as possible chance of fraud, that's one of the key things about having a constitutional provision relating to voting. And one of the things that was just referenced by the proponent is Internet voting. And I've been hearing about this for a while, and I've been seeing articles written by a lady named Dr. Barbara Simons, who has been writing articles about the ease with which transactions involving the Internet can be fraudulently conducted. And one of the articles that she writes, and I'm not going to try to recapitulate the whole thing, but people ask the question, well, if I can bank online successfully, if I can use my credit card online, it must be safe, and therefore I can be confident that the Internet is a safe and secure place to make transactions, to transact business, and if it's safe and secure for that, then like the U.S. mails and like other things, it should be safe and secure for something like voting. And Dr. Simons, who's a computer scientist and a programmer and done research for IBM and has been involved in this issue for many years, emphatically answers no. Because the criterion that people use, well, if I bank online, it must be safe, fails to recognize that every year in this country, banks spend millions of dollars reimbursing customers whose bank accounts have been pilfered by internet fraudsters. That every year, credit card companies have to deal with the same thing, where people use credit card information that they obtained through online sources or they use through online mechanisms to commit massive amounts of fraud. Now, for the banks and the credit card companies, it makes economic sense to just reimburse people because it's so much more financially beneficial for them to either do transactions online, to eliminate people from banks, not to have tellers doing transactions, but to let people do things by computer. But when it comes to voting, there is no reset button. There is no way for someone, the elections officials, for the Secretary of State's office, to reimburse the citizens if their votes are basically stolen. And there is no way, in many cases, with internet voting, to even know whether fraud has occurred. Now, this seemingly innocuous provision in our Constitution that requires the voters to gather for the purpose of voting on Election Day provides a mechanism of protection against using these kinds of systems. And I understand that this constitutional amendment does not require internet voting or require late voting or require early voting. But what it does is it eliminates the protection that a legislature, this legislature, will make the mistake, which has been made in perhaps 30 legislatures across this country, to allow, particularly for internet voting, which is so subject to the potential for fraud and so difficult to detect once the fraud has occurred, and in the case of an election, so impossible to correct once it has occurred. So this is a dangerous thing that we are doing here today, Mr. Speaker. We are eliminating a provision of our Constitution which has been there for a long time and whose effect, regardless of what the original intent was, but whose effect is to prevent this legislature from engaging in dangerous experiments. Because somebody shows up, somebody with a good lobbyist shows up with a proposal that you can save yourself a lot of money on Election Day by using internet voting. And we're always looking for ways to save money. And then we will enact a piece of legislation such that we will never be able to know who really won the elections and who did not. So we will subject our elections to the potential for being hacked by people not only in this country, but in foreign countries. Countries as disparate as Nigeria or China or countries in Eastern Europe, for whatever reason, just vandalism, or because someone's being paid to subvert our electoral process for some larger and darker purpose. But we will be opening that door by eliminating this protection. It would be almost as much, by eliminating this provision, if we were to eliminate that provision of our state's constitution that says that the terms of office for elected officials are set. Or if we were to eliminate that provision of our Constitution that provides for freedom of speech or freedom of religion. No one would say that would be a good idea, that we should just trust the legislature, trust the majority to do the right thing all the time, every time. That it's okay to not have these kinds of protections. No one would suggest that. This protection of our electoral process is, as you look at how things can be done by this legislature and what has been done in other states by other legislatures, this protection is at least as important as those other ones. It provides us with a stop. It prevents this legislature from engaging in potentially dangerous and damaging changes to our election laws in such a way that it will render the elections almost meaningless and subject to potentials for fraud. Now, on that point that I made about saving money, an innocuous example. In my hometown of Southbury, the Board of Selectmen decided, after the redistricting that we did in 2011, that they needed to move the voting district lines, and while they were at it, they decided to reduce from 5 polling places to 3. And the objective was to save some money. And the result was enormous long lines on Election Day in the town of Southbury. People not being able to find a place to park so they could park their car, so they could walk a fairly long distance across the parking lots to get to the polling places. Of people, and I have some video of this, of I don't know how many dozens of near accidents occurred as people were trying to back out or pull into parking spaces or maneuver around. And then of the long lines of people standing in the polling places, some of whom eventually gave up and went home or went to work, because I was there both in the morning and the evening. That's what happens when you try to save money. That problem was obvious, and that problem will be corrected, I assume, in the next election, because they're going to change the polling district lines and maybe go back to having an additional polling place, maybe go to 4 polling places. If we do this in the interest of convenience and in the belief that the legislature always gets it right when we change the law, we are, I believe, taking a very dangerous step and jeopardizing the rights of the citizens of the state of Connecticut, a right that is protected by this innocuous-sounding language saying that the voters shall gather on Election Day. That simple piece of language is what prevents this legislature from making some very big mistakes as we go do legislation on voting. So I would urge a no vote on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill.